So I'll start off. My name is Andrew Nelson. I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to today's Spence lecture featuring Jeff McKee on Taung, and welcoming people. One of the, there are lots of terrible things about the pandemic and Zoom, but one of the great things about Zoom is that we can really bring people in from all over. I see we've got people here from Toronto, Chicago, Georgia, Columbus, and Baltimore, if not more places. So it's great to have everybody coming together for us this afternoon. So with that, I'll leave it at that. I'll pass over to Sydney, who is one of the co-chairs of our undergraduate society, who is going to give the land acknowledgement, and then it'll come back to me to introduce the Spence lecture, and then we'll go to Ian to actually introduce our speaker today. So Sydney.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. I just want to make sure I've got everything in front of me here that I should have. I wrote it in advance so I could be very thoughtful with the way I spoke it. So my name is Sydney Dawson, and like Dr. Nelson said, I'm the co-president of the Anthropology Society, which is Western's undergraduate anthropology club on campus. I'm from Vancouver, BC, and I grew up in the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations as a settler. I'm now thankful to be able to live and learn at Western University here in London. I'd like to give a land acknowledgement on behalf of the department and the Anthropology Society before we begin the lecture, both to draw attention to the ongoing dynamics of settler colonialism that underpin this institution, and to affirm our disciplinary commitment to recognize racism and colonialism that has existed and still does exist within anthropology. Land acknowledgements are not a solution or an absolution to this, and their risk of becoming performative should be closely examined, but I hope that it can be a respectful way to continue conversations about our harmful history here in Canada, reconciliation and reflexivity. It's our responsibility as an institution, as residents of Turtle Island, and as anthropologists. So, without further ado, Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewauk, and Chinungton nations. These lands are connected with the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum and the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796, and therefore play an important role in acknowledging our historic and continued relationships with these nations and their members. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action number 45 states, these treaties should be renewed and established based on principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for maintaining those relationships into the future. In acknowledgement of the Indigenous caretakers of these lands and of the treaty in wampum, we also acknowledge the longstanding and continued injustices faced by Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. Sorry. And our commitment to continue educating about and working to dismantle these conditions. For those in attendance who would like to learn or understand more about the traditional territories on which they are located, I encourage you to visit the web pages Native Land and Whose Land, links to which I will be sending in the chat. And the Indigenous initiatives at Western have thoughtfully done the labor of providing a really amazing piece about land acknowledgements historically, as well as they relate to Western University, called More Than Words, and I will also be sending that in the chat. So on behalf of the Anthropology Society, I'd like to thank you all for being here and thank these native lands for having us, and wish you to enjoy the lecture.
Thanks very much, Sydney. Very nicely done. So I'm going to give a little introduction to the lecture series and to Mike Spence now. So the Spence Lecture Series was founded in 2010 in honor of Dr. Michael Spence's crucial contribution to the field of anthropology and to this department. The lecture series is only one of a number of special offerings that honor the life and work of Mike Spence, including symposia in 2006-2014, special issue of the Ontario Archaeology Journal, and the 2014 Smith-Wintenberg Award from the Canadian Archaeological Association for outstanding contributions to the discipline of archaeology. So who is this guy Spence? Well, Spence was turned on to archaeology apparently by picking up books in his high school library. He went on to do his BA and MA at the University of Toronto, working in the archaeology of Ontario. He went on to the University of Southern Illinois for his PhD. And along the way, he connected with the Teotihuacan Mapping Project, setting the stage for his dual geographic interests, the Great Lakes of Ontario and Teotihuacan in Mexico. He began studying the obsidian at Teotihuacan, but rapidly found that the topic would be too massive to cover within a single dissertation. So he switched to the human skeletal material from Teotihuacan, looking to make inferences about social structure. This set the stage for Mike's other dual identity, an archaeologist interested in material culture and a skeletal biologist interested in human skeletal remains. Mike completed his dissertation in 1971 and right away moved up here to London to take up a position at Western, coming up with his lovely wife, Jean, and where he settled it rapidly into a rich career in archaeology in Ontario and Mexico, and in bioarchaeology and forensics. Mike was key in reshaping the department in the early mid-1990s when Chris White and Chris Ellis were hired as allies to transform bioarchaeology at Western into what it is today. Mike also served as Lawson Chair from 2003 until his retirement in 2006. As I was preparing these remarks, I rifled through lots of file cabinets and hard drives, going into things many of you won't even understand, tractor feed printouts from printers, very old printers. But the most recent Vita I have for Mike is from 2015. And I know Mike has continued to be productive since then, even connecting with some students from 25 years ago. And Angelique, I'm not sure if you're on the call, but that would include you. But as of 2015, Mike had published 4 monographs, 38 book chapters, 44 journal articles, and myriad publications in local journals, newsletters, and reports. And his list of conference presentations runs for 7 pages. I recall Mike saying that every time a new paper was published, he celebrated that evening with a nice bottle of wine with breakfast, or with supper, pardon me. So Mike, that's a lot of red wine that you were celebrating with. But the consistent threads in all the testimonials to Mike are his sense of humor, his dedication to his students, his work ethic, and his seemingly endless supply of Teotihuacan t-shirts. Mike, I'm proud to count you as a colleague and friend, and I greatly appreciate your contributions to the discipline and for making the department what it is today. Thanks very much. And I will now hand over to Ian to actually introduce our speaker.
Sure. It's my pleasure to introduce our 2022 Spence Lecture speaker, Dr. Jeffrey McKee. Dr. McKee's academic history includes undergraduate studies at Miami University of Ohio with a major in anthropology, followed by master's and PhD work at Washington University in St. Louis, or WashU to those in the know. Defending in 1985 his dissertation on human dental wear and facial form. Between 1986 and 1996, Dr. McKee was affiliated with the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology at the University of the Witwatersrand Medical School in Johannesburg, South Africa. While there, he became senior lecturer in that department. From 1996 to the present, Jeff has been based at the Ohio State University. I understand that is how you were supposed to say it, the Ohio State, in Columbus, Ohio, where he is professor in the Department of Anthropology and professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology. Over the last 40 years, his research interests have included, but are not limited to, paleoanthropology, evolutionary theory, craniofacial morphology, and mammalian ecology and paleontology. You will find Dr. McKee's fieldwork at the Taung fossil hominin site from 1988 to 1993, presented in a Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology paper, co-authored with fellow WashU alum and former WITS colleague, Dr. Kevin Kuykendall. This from 2016, entitled "The Dart Deposits of the Buxton Limeworks, Taung, South Africa, and the Context of the Taung Australopithecus Fossil." I'm sure this is something we can look forward to hearing more about from Dr. McKee this afternoon in his Spence lecture entitled "Taung, the Nexus of African Paleoanthropology." Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jeffrey McKee.
Hold on here a second. Let me get my screen up here. There we go. Okay, well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, everybody, for having me. And it's an honor to give the Spence lecture. I took a look at Mike Spence's CV yesterday, and it's very impressive. So I feel quite honored to be here. So what I'm going to do today is take you on a trip to South Africa and a bit to London as well, another London, and back to South Africa again. And we're going to start at Taung in South Africa. Taung is located right here. There's Johannesburg, and there is the location of Taung. It's quite literally on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. This scene behind me is literally the southeastern margin of the Kalahari Desert, and that's where Taung is. Now, the story of Taung is supposed to start with Raymond Dart. He was a professor at the University of the, I can't even say it anymore, University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And he was an anatomist who specialized in human brains and whatnot. But the story doesn't start there. It actually starts with this woman to his left. It is Josephine Salmons. She was a student in the Department of Anatomy at the Wits Medical School. And she brought to Raymond Dart a fossilized baboon skull. And he found that quite interesting. He had never really dabbled in fossils before, but he found that interesting and asked that any other specimens be brought back to him, asked where it came from, and she said it was from Taung. At the time, 1924, Taung was a limestone quarry. South Africa had recently discovered gold in the Johannesburg area, and back then they used limestone to process the gold, and they needed limestone for building materials and for agriculture and all sorts of things. So limestone quarries were all over the place, including at the edge of the Kalahari Desert here. And with a blast of dynamite, every now and then, they would hit a pocket of red sandstone. And this red sandstone represents the infill of ancient caves that had formed in the limestone. And they didn't find it to be economically viable, so they left those bits of sandstone behind. And that's good for us because inside those caves were fossilized animals and plants, for that matter. And so a geologist named Robert Young was down visiting Taung, and he walked around and talked to the quarriers and to the quarry manager, and they had all sorts of fossils that they had been collecting. So he talked them out of keeping them as paperweights on their desk and whatnot. And he put them all in a crate and sent it by train up to Johannesburg for Raymond Dart to have a look at. There's this big box of fossils. And the first thing he pulled out was this. There you can see it for scale. And it looks like a rock, and it is a rock. But Dart, being an expert on the brain, immediately recognized it as an endocast. What had happened is that about 2.6 or so million years ago, an individual had gotten deposited in a cave. The skull filled up with sediments, and that solidified. Then with a blast of dynamite, this came out. The skull was left behind, but this came out, this rock. And you can see the gyri and sulci of the brain. And this artery here is the middle meningeal artery that feeds the coverings of the brain. So Dart realized he had something very special here. and it looked a bit larger than the baboon skulls he had seen. And in particular, he noticed the position of the foramen magnum. Now, the foramen magnum is the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord meets the brain. And Dart noticed that that hole was fairly far forward. In a quadruped or even in a knuckle walker like a chimp or a gorilla, the foramen magnum is in the back of the skull facing downwards and backwards, whereas this foramen magnum was pointing straight down, and he found that to be quite curious. Certainly not what you would find in a baboon. So he reached into the box again and found a rock that looked like that. That's all he could see of it. But he noticed fairly readily that that rock fit the endocast. So, as the legend goes, he took out his wife's steel knitting needles, and after 40 days and 40 nights, he revealed this face. It's a face of a child. You could tell that because these are the deciduous teeth, or the baby teeth. This is the first permanent molar coming in. It's not quite all the way in yet, but it's coming in. But this didn't look like a baboon. It didn't look like a human. It was something quite unique. Fast forward to the 1990s, Glenn Conroy came to South Africa, and we had a chance to put this skull into CAT scans. And we could see the developing teeth. That was a fantastic evening, just watching slice after slice after slice of this ancient skull be revealed. And so, although you get your, or humans get their first permanent molars at about age 6, from seeing the developing teeth, we could determine that this creature probably died when it was about 3 or 4 years old. Now, Dart gave it the name Australopithecus africanus. Austral means southern, which was a bit of a joke because Dart was originally from Australia. Pithecus means ape. Then Africanus obviously refers to the continent. So he published it in 1925 as the southern ape of Africa. But when he published it, he talked about how that position of the foramen magnum meant that this creature stood upright, had upright posture, and walked on 2 legs, was bipedal. So although he called it the southern ape of Africa, it was actually the southern hominin of Africa. Well, back then they would have said hominid. And that was quite controversial for quite a while. For a lot of reasons that we'll go over. But in 1871, this guy, who you've probably heard of, Charles Darwin, wrote, "In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee, and as these 2 species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere." So I had the occasion to meet Raymond Dart on his 94th birthday. We had a nice little meal at his apartment in Johannesburg with his wife, Marjorie. And we got talking about Taung, of course. And he said, he was still quite feisty even at 94. He said, "Darwin said that man evolved in Africa, and I proved it." Well, he gave the first evidence for it anyway. But it remained controversial. Not everybody accepted it. So in 1931, he took the specimen to London for experts to look at and assess. They still weren't quite convinced that it was one of our relatives, that they thought rather it was a chimp or whatnot. So Raymond Dart went back to South Africa rather dejected. But he left the fossil in London so that the great paleontologist and anatomist Grafton Elliott Smith could study it some more. I was a fellow Australian of Dart's, who ended up in London. And Dora Dart, Raymond Dart's first wife, was supposed to bring the skull back after Elliott Smith had studied it. She was in London finishing up some studies in pharmacy. So she picked up the skull from Grafton Elliott Smith and went back to her apartment and up to her room and realized that she had left the skull in the taxi cab. So this little guy was riding all around London with nobody having any idea that this 2.5 million year old fossil was in there. And Dora panicked and she called the police, and eventually they tracked it down. They got the skull back and she took it back to South Africa. But she never lived down that story, which is why we refer to her as Dart's first wife. And it's also why they divorced about a year later. It's also why it was very hard for me to find a picture of her. She hasn't been heralded in the annals of the Taung story very much. So, why was it so controversial? Well, one was geography. It was found in South Africa, and nobody expected to find our ancestors in South Africa. People were looking in Europe and finding Neanderthals. People were looking in Asia, and around the same time found some Homo erectus. Certainly not in Africa, and certainly not, as Raymond Dart put it, the asshole of Africa. That's where it was found. But they had forgotten Darwin's insight. They had forgotten that Darwin had hypothesized that humans first evolved in Africa and were related to the ancestors of the chimps and gorillas. Well, why else? Well, one was the juvenile status. This is the Taung skull, and it is compared here to an outline of a chimpanzee juvenile of approximately the same age and same dental development. And they're a bit different, but back then they didn't have a lot of comparative material. So to others, this looked as much like a chimp as it did a potential hominin. Also, it was thought back then that the brain was the first thing to evolve in humans. And then with a larger brain, then we could stand up and walk in a civilized way. But bipedality, walking on two legs, was supposed to come later. But they had forgotten their Lamarck's insight. Lamarck is the guy who's famous for transformism, a pre-Darwinian view of evolution. But in 1800, Lamarck suggested that the very first step, both literally and figuratively, of human evolution was to walk on two legs. That was a very prescient insight as well. The other problem was the unknown geological age. Nobody knew how old the Taung skull was. There hadn't been any formal geological investigation at Taung to determine an age. The estimates ranged from only 10,000 years old, which would pretty much eliminate it from being an early hominin ancestor, to 2 million years old. Now, what's funny about that is all those ages from 10,000 to 2 million years were in a series of 5 papers, all written by the same person, all written by Robert Broom. And he just kept on changing his mind. So that threw people off for quite a while. But eventually, they were convinced when from the site of Sterkfontein, we got an adult Australopithecus africanus. It had a lot of the same features as the juvenile of Taung. And that ranges, it's debatable, but somewhere between 3.4 and 2.5 million years ago. And then people are convinced it also had a forward foramen magnum and the prognathism, or the face that sticks out, and so on. Now let's fit this into the general pattern before we go back to Taung. This is a view of human evolution, very narrowed down view, but we start somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago. That's when the molecular clock of mitochondrial DNA says that human ancestors and chimp ancestors split. And we have some interesting fossils from 6 to 7 million years ago, such as this one, Sahelanthropus chadensis. And it may be a hominin, it may be an ape ancestor. It's kind of hard to tell at that stage. That is followed later by East African fossils, such as Australopithecus afarensis, that's Lucy's species. And then that's followed in time between 3 and 2.5 million years ago by Australopithecus africanus, including the Taung child, although still we do not have a date for the Taung child. The Australopithecines lead to two things. They lead to early Homo habilis, the first member of our genus, and they led to what are known as the robust Australopithecines. Australopithecus robustus in South Africa, Australopithecus boisei in East Africa, which had these large teeth and robust jaws for grinding tough and hard vegetation. They eventually went extinct, but early Homo went on to evolve into Homo erectus. Homo erectus then evolved into what we know as archaic Homo sapiens. Aren't quite Homo sapiens, but they're close. And the Neanderthals are an example of an archaic Homo sapien. And then finally, by 100,000 years ago, probably a little bit earlier, we have Homo sapiens sapiens. So that's where Taung is in the lineage of hominins leading to ourselves. Well, one thinks of Raymond Dart as being the discoverer of the Taung child, but actually, Dart did not go there. Oops. Go back, go back. There we go. Dart did not actually go to Taung until 1948. And this is a picture from that expedition. There was an American expedition that worked at Taung in 1948, a fairly brief expedition that formed some of the basics of what we know about Taung, but they didn't do a lot. And then Taung sort of sat around. The limestone quarry was still active, blasting away. And then in 1986, this young man went to South Africa and met up with Philip Tobias, who hired me. Philip was the doyen of African paleoanthropology. He was the successor to Raymond Dart at the anatomy department at the University of Witwatersrand, or Wits Medical School. And here he's showing me the original of the Taung skull. And Tobias is quite a revered individual in South Africa. He's a big name for fighting apartheid, and he was a big name for paleoanthropology and a big name for all sorts of studies in human biology. So he was quite revered. And on this particular occasion, he was showing us the original of the Taung skull. There were a number of us who were new to the department. We were all sitting around this carpeted table as he talked. And he wanted to point out some features on the face. So he asked one of the persons in the room if he could use his mechanical pencil for a pointer. And so he started pointing things out on the skull, not realizing that the lead on the mechanical pencil was out. So Tobias was drawing all over this precious fossil. And we were all horrified. You don't tell someone like Tobias to stop doing that. And so we sat there and watched in horror as he drew all over the skull. I have a biographical paper on Tobias coming out in the next week or two, where I tell that story. Because it's kind of an illustration of how revered Tobias really was. And so in his own way, Tobias commanded that I go forth and multiply the number of hominin fossils from Taung. Hopefully find a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a cousin, whatever, of this poor orphan child. And so off we went. And the fossil site's actually in the village of Buxton. It's known as the Buxton Lime Works. And we went off with our dynamite truck in our field office. Now, this truck was designed to carry dynamite because at earlier fossil sites in South Africa, they actually used dynamite to get the fossils out of the rock, the way the Taung skull had come out originally. But we weren't going to use dynamite. We had picks and shovels and things like that. But this truck was designed to carry dynamite so that the exhaust wasn't back here where the dynamite was. The exhaust was right here, where the exhaust goes right up into the window of the driver, of course. So we had a lot of fun with the dynamite truck, and we had all of our equipment and the all-important castle logger that we'd have at the end of each day. And there's the village of Buxton with the limeworks in the background. Now, at the time I started there in 1987, actually, the Taung area had been put into its own pseudo country under grand apartheid. So it was in the country of Bophuthatswana. And the limestone quarry closed down when Bophuthatswana became a separate homeland or country, according to South Africa. And the people were just stuck there without jobs, without anything. They couldn't really leave the country because they weren't South African citizens, they were Bophuthatswana citizens. And no one outside of South Africa recognized Bophuthatswana as a country. So they were stuck there. This is how they typically live. The grass is greener because this was just after a spring rain. Usually it's just dry and dusty here. But they were happy when I came back year after year for 7 field seasons and giving them jobs. At one point, I hired 40 people from the local village of Buxton. Usually it was less than that. But this is what we find when we get to the limeworks, the Buxton limeworks of Taung. Once again, there is the edge of the Kalahari Desert. And they had blasted away down to various levels and left behind these pinnacles of sandstone that weren't economically viable for them. And once again, that was good for us because that's where the fossils are. And so they went down to this level, and then they go down to another level and another level still. But then they quit when Bophuthatswana became a country again. So we set up shop at Taung, at the fossil site. This monument that had been placed there on a Taung anniversary represented the approximate spot that the Taung child had come from, or at least as best as they could reconstruct it based on the 1948 field work and the people talking to the quarry workers who had found the fossils that ended up in the box in the Raymond Dart. And so at the tip of this pyramid, this monument, is the alleged spot that the Taung child came from. Well, this area over here wasn't very promising. This is what we know as the Dart Pinnacle. And it's very steep and very dangerous. So we set up on this pinnacle where Lech Hrdlička had found some fossil baboons. Hrdlička was the founder of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, now the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. And he was the first scientist after the discovery of the Taung child to visit Taung in 1925. As I said, he found some fossil baboons here, but didn't really make a huge study out of it. But we set up shop there, put up a grid. My students and I and the locally hired workers started chipping away at the surface, knowing that Hrdlička had found something there. And after a week of chipping away, we finally found one tiny little rodent tooth. And I got all excited. And my student said, Dr. McKee, you're crazy. It's just a rodent tooth. And I said, yes, but if we can find a rodent tooth, then I know we're going to find a lot more. This is a sign that we're digging in the right area. And so sure enough, we started digging, started finding. The next year we came back and got a little bit more sophisticated. So we set up a grid system on top. And rather than chip away at the surface, we drilled down through the roof of the limestone cave with this drill. I get very sentimental about this drill because I held it near me for many, many hours, for many, many years. But what we do is drill down through the rock. We break off a rock, and then we take it to this mock grid system, and so we can keep track of where everything comes from. We break up the rocks, and if we find something, then we put it in this other mock grid system to keep track of where it comes from. So each one of these little piles here has a fossil in it. It has some fossils in it. We were finding lots of fossils, not very good fossils at first, but eventually we started finding better fossils. And what we're digging through, this red sandstone, is something we call breccia. And breccia is an Italian word that means something like broken things or broken up stuff. And here, one of my locally hired workers from Buxton, Thomas Liu, has broken up this rock. And there is a bit of a baboon skull, the back of the cranium of a extinct baboon. Well, every now and then, since I brought jobs every wintertime and brought money and lived in the village, I was quite popular. And everybody knew who Mr. Jeff was. That's how everyone in the village knew me. Every now and then, an old man would walk up and I'd show him a fossil like this. And it was always the same question, even though it was different old men. I'd say, Mr. Jeff, how does it come that that bone gets in that rock? And kind of like a ship in a bottle type of question. Well, you just saw Amos Liu. These people I hired in Buxton, they have no formal education whatsoever, but they're very bright people. Most of them speak about 5 different languages. And within a week, I was able to train them to recognize bones in the fossil, in the breccia. And so if I can train them, I can train you. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at a little bit of a vertebra there. But over here is the left orbit of a fossil baboon. Oh, and there's the cross section of a long bone. Here's the muzzle of the baboon. Excuse me. The zygomatic arch, or the cheekbone, going back here. And so we find something like this, and then we gradually chip away at it to expose it. And eventually we reconstruct it as something like that. So there is the fossil in the rock. There is the bone in the rock. Well, how did it get there? Well, Taung is in an area, this escarpment again is the edge of the Kalahari Desert. It's made of dolomite. Dolomite is a Precambrian limestone that formed at the sea floor and eventually got pushed up into the continent. And dolomite, being a limestone, is porous. And so water filters down through the dolomite and forms water tables in the dolomite. Now, the water tables then come out as springs. And the springs take this limestone infused water and redeposit it as tufa. And it's tufa that the caves here form in. Other caves in South Africa actually form in the dolomite itself, in what used to be the water tables. But here we have a secondary deposit of limestone known as tufa. And tufa then builds layer after layer after layer out and can form caves like this. This cave is about 15 meters across and 10 meters deep. And this is the kind of small cave that the Taung child would have been washed into or dragged into some time ago. So normally I work at Taung in the wintertime. Every now and then I visit in the summer. And during the summer, it's very hot out at the edge of the Kalahari. So you get up in the morning and you do some work for about an hour, and you sit under a tree for the rest of the day, keeping cool, or as cool as possible. And then in the evening, go out and do some more work, looking at caves and fossil sites and whatnot. Well, I was sitting under a tree one day, and two boys came down very excited. Mr. Jeff, look what we have. And one boy was holding a chain that had at its bottom a trap, a snare, and a dead juvenile baboon. And the boys were very excited about having caught the baboon. See, they think of baboons as vermin. I actually studied the baboons, the live baboons, as well as the fossil ones, the live baboons out there, wrote a couple papers on their live behavior. So I was quite fascinated by them, but to the locals, baboons were just vermin that would raid their crops, the little crops that they had. And so these boys had trapped this baboon who died, and they wanted to give it to Mr. Jeff. And who is Mr. Jeff to say no to young lads? So I decided I'd do something useful with it, and I took it to that cave. This is the cave we were just looking at. And I put it back in the cave. This was just for the picture. This was before we had good lighting and stuff. I took this juvenile baboon, put it in a cave, and then waited to see what would happen to it. So this is what's known as a taphonomic experiment. Taphonomy is the study of the grave. It's the study of what happens to something after it dies. And I wanted to see what happened to this baboon because we were finding lots of extinct baboons in the Hrdlicka Pinnacle. And they were all kind of jumbled up. So I wanted to see what happened. A month later, I came back, and this is what I found. This is that same juvenile baboon. There is a, what do we have here? A humerus or an arm bone, and there's an ulna here somewhere. Here's the skull, or at least the cranium of that juvenile baboon. And here's the mandible, or the lower jaw of that juvenile baboon. So this was 1 month later. In just 1 month, the actions of the maggots that had defleshed this baboon had removed the skull from the mandible, or the mandible from the rest of the skull. And then we watched this year after year after year. And it started to get deposited. A lot of the bones disappeared. So that's why you never have a full representation of a baboon in a fossil site. We watched it year after year. By the last time I checked it, there were 14% of the bones remaining. And so that's why fossilization is incomplete. But you can imagine if a leopard was bringing baboons on a regular basis into a cave, that this would build up. The sediments would build up on that with the red sands of the Kalahari, and eventually they would fossilize. And that is how it comes that bone gets in that rock. Okay, well, what we were finding mostly were extinct baboons, such as the ones that Josephine Salmons brought to Raymond Dart to start this whole story. These are two different species of extinct baboons. And these are both large males for their species. This is a modern female baboon. So males are larger than females. So obviously in the evolution of baboons, the baboons got larger. But if you look at the neurocranium, the part that holds the brain, these neurocranium, the skulls are very squat compared to this modern day female. But the long bones that we found of the baboons, the Herdlichka pinnacle, are about the same size as a modern day female. That means that over the last 2.5 million years or so, baboons have increased their brain size for body size, a process called encephalization. That's what humans or hominids went through, was a process of encephalization, increasing our brain size for our body size. So if the baboons keep on with this trend, then maybe in about 2 or 3 million years, we'll have large brain baboons giving Zoom lectures on extinct humans or something like that. Who knows? Okay, well, that's all well and good. I love the baboons. But according to Gary Larson, the anthropologist's dream is a beautiful woman in one hand and the fossilized skull of Australopithecus in the other. My female graduate students remind me that that's the male anthropologist's dream. But anyway, we were digging away and digging away. And there, if you look at my hands, I got the beautiful woman in one hand. But if you look at my other hand, it is empty. No Australopithecus. So I started thinking about this site in different ways. We were working on the Herdlichka pinnacle over here. And in the shadow of the Dart pinnacle was this monument representing the spot where the Taung child allegedly came from. But nobody really knows where it came from because it was blasted out with dynamite. So it's just a guess as to where it was. And at about that time, I was thinking about this. A friend of mine from Italy brought me this picture. His uncle, Video Cipriani, had taken this photo, and he said that the man on this cable here was somewhat near the spot that the Taung skull had come from. And so that was a better clue than we had before. And so I went up to that spot, and we borrowed a ladder from the plumber in the village, and went up to that spot. And I found some breccia, but nothing really promising, just small little deposits of breccia. But once again, nobody knew where the Taung skull had come from. And I started thinking about that, well, paleoanthropologists and paleontologists in general generally dig down. And in the quarry floor, there might have been more deposits. So this is very unconventional paleoanthropology, but they were building a road nearby, and all of this limestone dust and gravel had been brought in for the ceremony to unveil this monument. The president of Bophuthatswana came in a helicopter, and they had this big ceremony. And then it just kind of got left there. But they were building a road nearby, so we hired this guy and his bulldozer to come and clear off this overburden that had been placed there for the monument. And this was one of the most fun Saturday mornings I've ever had. Just watching all this stuff gets swept away. I tried to convince the bulldozer driver to accidentally bump into the monument, because underneath the monument there might have been a deposit, but he wouldn't do that. But we did get a lot cleared off, and by hand we cleared off the rest of the quarry floor. And we started over here, went along, we found some cave deposits, but they were sandy. They weren't breccified or solidified. There were no fossils there. We kept on going and going and going, and then over here, we found some fossil deposits. And that was the area, you remember this 1948 photo, it's right at the edge where the quarry goes down to another level. So this edge here is this edge here from when Raymond Dart first visited. So we were just at the edge, but we found deposits. Now, what was fortunate about that is that we found not only fossil bones, but fossil eggshells. Now, there's nothing remarkable about an eggshell. Obviously, birds were around back then. I still find it somewhat remarkable, though, that well over 2.5 million years ago, some guinea fowl hatched out of this egg, and that egg is still intact so many years later. Here's a bit of a turtle carapace as well. But the significance of the yellowish eggshell is that the quarriers had said that right before they found the Taung skull, they had been finding yellowish eggshells. Well, we thought, having worked on the Hrdlicka pinnacle, that they were confused by these limestone nodules that you get that look kind of like an egg. But then we found, indeed, they were right. There were yellowish eggshells, which are representative of a guinea fowl. So we knew we were in the right area. We also found more fossil baboons, of course, including this mandible or lower jaw of Parapapio brumi. Now, the significance of that is that this is an older species of extinct baboon. What we've been finding in the Hrdlicka pinnacle were more recent extinct baboons. So what we've done by clearing the quarry floor and going across, we were moving back in time. Because I was telling you how, the tufa works its way out layer after layer after layer. Well, on the one end was this deposit, and then on the other end were the Hrdlicka deposits. So we were very excited and excavated the entirety of that deposit, except for leaving a witness section behind. But alas, the Taung child remained an orphan. We never found more Australopithecus africanus. But we did find out a lot about the context of the Taung child. So we can reconstruct the Taung environment as a savanna grassland based on the types of animals that we found there. They are animals that are adapted to savanna grasslands. And that is what Dart had thought Taung was, although he was right for the wrong reason. He thought that Taung had never changed and that it was the same now as it was when the Taung child was deposited. Turns out that just 100,000 years ago, the Taung area was a complete swamp. So the environment had changed quite a lot, but it did turn out to be a savanna environment. And that's what led Dart to the idea of the savanna hypothesis, the idea that the reason natural selection favored bipedal walking in early hominins was because they were walking across the grassland savannas. Well, we now know that the early hominins evolved in a forested area first, long before the savannas were established. So still nice to know that there's a savanna grassland there. Meanwhile, at the other site I work at, in South Africa, up in the northern part of South Africa, is Makapanska. And there we find Australopithecus fossils. And there it was 3 million years ago, a lush subtropical forest. So our Australopithecine ancestors lived in the forest and the savanna, which means that they were adaptable. They weren't adapted to a very specific environment. And that is the key to the survival of Australopithecus and key to the survival of all hominins leading up to us. It's the adaptability. You know, these early hominins, Australopithecus, were slow, bipedal, 3.5, 4 foot tall animals, but they managed to survive and eventually evolve into us because of their adaptability. They could eat all sorts of kinds of foods and live in all sorts of different kinds of environments. So that is the key to human evolution in my mind, is the adaptability. And with that, I'm missing a slide. Anyway, I had a slide on the actual date of the site. That seems to have disappeared. So I'll end there. Because we moved back in time, the Taung child probably came from around 2.6 million years ago. But with that, I thank you, and I will open it for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I realize when I'm clapping there that people are virtually clapping, but the sound of one person clapping isn't quite as dramatic as I maybe planned. But thank you so much for such an engaging talk. I'm going to sort of handle and manage questions, and I have some questions, so you needn't worry about that. But I want to make sure I don't monopolize conversation right away. So if anyone does have a question, please raise your hand or put it into the chat. I know there are a number of grad students who are watching in the seminar room, so I've also asked them to put questions into the chat if possible. But is there anyone that would like to kick off questions? I have a lot of, oh, there, Andrew, yes. There we go.
So Jeff, one thing you didn't mention was Piltdown, and what Piltdown had to do with the reception of Taung. Do you want to make a comment about that?
Yeah, I kind of skipped over that because I had a limited time for the talk. But yeah, that's another reason that the Taung child was rejected. I mentioned that people had assumed that the brain evolved before we became upright and bipedal, and they had evidence for that in the term or in the form of a fossil skull from Piltdown. The skull had a human-like brain and an ape-like mandible or lower jaw. Well, the reason it was a human-like skull is because it was a human skull from an archaeological site. And the lower jaw was actually an orangutan mandible that they had stained to match the archaeological find. They filed down the teeth and did all sorts of things. They broke off the condyle, the articular part, so that you couldn't notice that it wouldn't work with that skull. And so it was a fraud. It was a big fraud. But I collect old textbooks, and quite a few of them have Piltdown Euanthropocini as a legitimate species. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Joseph Weiner and others did a study of the Piltdown skull. They could do x-rays of it and whatnot, and discovered how the mandible had been manipulated to look like an ancient mandible. And they could x-ray it and see the filings from the teeth in the tooth pulp. So it was a fraud, but it threw people off for a long, long time. Not everybody was convinced, but it wasn't until the 1950s that it was proven to be a fraud, a hoax.
Oh, someone has posed a question about the pencil marks on the skull and what happened to them. Can you just use an eraser? It's a fairly important question for, I think, any student working with skeletons to think of. So,
Well, it's just a mechanical pencil, so the lead just kind of, you could just wipe it off. You wouldn't even need an eraser. But other things have happened to the Taung skull. You look at its, I don't know if you can see that here. Look at its teeth. The incisors are fairly worn down. And if you look at old pictures of the Taung skull, it had fairly complete incisors or front teeth. And that's from years and years and years of scientists coming in with their metal calipers and measuring those teeth. As they measured them, they wore them down more and more and more. That's a bit worse than the pencil.
very good point. I would like to ask you a question about the baboons. I mean, it's the difference in, brain size and body size that you noted in the fossil baboons is really, really fascinating. And then you mentioned finding the earlier parapapia, which is a mandible. Do you have any long bones, or are there any cranial elements of that that would sort of enlighten those long-term trends?
Not from Taung. The deposit that the Taung skull probably came from, which is that deposit, was very sparsely littered. What had probably happened, you saw that that Tufa cave. We did another taphonomic experiment in that where, well, it's kind of a natural experiment, but a donkey had drowned and had washed to the back of the cave and got deposited. That is probably what happened to the Taung child itself. It explains why it's a singularity, that there's, just one child may have drowned, or or a leopard may have brought him near, or whatever. But it wasn't a deposit that was regularly accumulating animals. So we have a couple of long bones of baboons from that deposit, but not many.
Okay, interesting. Just speaking of the taphonomy, I think, and that taphonomic experiment you did is really interesting. And I don't know if, I'm not familiar if there are other taphonomic experiments in South African caves, but I wondered if you could comment on anything about the taphonomy of anything like Rising Star, where it's been interpreted so dramatically, but it, to me, looks like something that would be due to similar processes. I don't know if could comment on how this might apply to other caves. Or...
Yeah, every cave is different. That's the one thing you learn when you work in South Africa. They all accumulate things differently. So what I find at Taung doesn't apply to Sterkfontein, where this skull came from. Darts interpreted the fossils at Makapanska, which is a much larger cave, as being the remains of a killer ape that Australopithecus was beating each other up and whatnot. That, like the Savannah hypothesis, has since been rejected. But the Rising Star cave is quite fascinating because it has almost no animal remains other than the hominin remains. And it was kind of ironic because about 5 years ago, or well, at least 2 years before that discovery was made, I asked my students a question on an exam to form a hypothesis that if they found a cave that had just hominin remains and no other animals, how would you interpret that? So, when that cave actually came out, I was like, wow, I was way ahead of my time there. But yeah, there's discussion as to whether or not that's an intentional burial or not. I suspect it's not, because that cave is very narrow. And so it's very difficult to get in or to bring a body in. And it's very difficult to get out. So what I tell my students is that the reason we have so many hominins in there is because one went in and it was dark in there and it couldn't find its way out. And he said, "Help, I'm stuck." And then another one came and couldn't find its way out and said, "Help, we're stuck." And that just kept on accumulating for 15 individuals or whatever. That's just a joke, but I mean, that could be the way it happened. It also could be that that was where people went to die intentionally. So that's kind of an intentional burial, but it might be that they're old and starving and they know they don't have much longer, and so they just go there to disappear.
That's interesting.
I think that is my preferred explanation, but we'll never know.
Ian, I think, has a question.
Yeah, Jeff, you put the whole history of the Taung child into this long historical perspective, and as we're coming up on the century anniversary of the discovery of Taung, are you aware of any plans or efforts in place in South Africa to sort of, make like a national celebration of the anniversary? I'm thinking, for example, I remember hearing a few years ago in Sweden, in association with the 300th year anniversary of Linnaeus's birth, there was a year-long national celebration. Linnaeus is a national hero still in Sweden. Anything like that on the agenda for South Africa and the Taung child centenary?
I haven't heard anything yet, but that doesn't mean nothing's going on. I certainly am going to be putting some things together. I have a half-written book on Taung that I hope to have finished by then and published. And I'm probably going to organize some sort of volume of chapters, from various authors, interpreting various aspects of Australopithecus africanus. So that's what I have planned, but I don't know what they're doing down there.
Are there any other questions? I do, if I may I ask one more? I'm not sort of asking our chair. I don't want to ask hawk. So I want to turn back to those baboons for a minute. And I like the comment you made about, in an alternate universe, there may be encephalized baboons sort of thing. And that highlights that something that you've, stressed in a lot of your work, which is historic contingency, the fact that, random events change the outcome of things in evolution. I think that moving away from directionality is kind of a challenge that it's often hard to translate to students. So from your perspective, and maybe in this time period, or are there, what do you think is a good example of, some historic contingent event that may have, like if you were trying to explain the importance of it in early hominin evolution, is there anything that you draw on? Or?
Yeah, there's a lot of contingent events, but just the discovery of the Taung child itself, and that is contingency that led all of paleoanthropology to Africa in the first place. If that had not happened, goodness knows when we would have started investigating Africa, let alone South Africa, as a place for human origins. So that one event is significant. That's why I call it the nexus of African paleoanthropology. That one event has set off a whole chain of things, including the divorce of Raymond Dart. But anyway, one thing is that as our diet changed, our faces got smaller. And that contingency allowed for the brain to enlarge, develop, curve over some more. So the fact that we changed our diet is in part what led to the expansion of the brain. The baboons can't do that because they have these big, large muscles. If their muscles were to reduce in size, if they changed their diet, then their brains could continue to evolve even more.
Cool, thanks. And I think Ian's got another question.
Yeah, I'll do a double dip here as well. So picking up on contingencies, Jeff, another sort of aspect of the saga of the Taung child that you didn't raise was the eagle predation interpretation of how the individual ended up at Taung in the first place. Although the raising of contingencies that you just made, rather than a primary predation event, scavenging suddenly becomes a possibility, and the keyhole fractures and the eye orbits and so forth. Is that eagle predation interpretation still as solid as it was about, I guess it's almost 15 years now since it got all that fanfare in the media initially? That's lots of coverage.
Well, it's a cool story. I don't buy into it for a number of reasons. One is that the evidence that was used for eagle predation of baboons came from the Hrdlicka Pinnacle, not from the area where the Taung child was found. Now, can't see this up close, but right here in the back of the skull is an indentation where the skull had been pushed in. That could have been from just about any sort of trauma, but it's in exactly the right place for a leopard to have placed its lower teeth. So a leopard is a possibility. Drowning is still a possibility. Just and that would explain the singularity, as I said, that it was just a child lost. And in the pools at Taung today, upstream from the cave I was showing you, kids die there or drown there every year, sadly. So that is a possibility as well. But I've never really bought into the eagle predation hypothesis. I think it could have contributed to deposits both at Taung and Makapansgat, but I don't think it was the sole source or even the main source. Also, you mentioned the V-shaped peckings in the eye orbit. Well, that is what eagles do, but what we found was a guinea fowl egg, not eagle eggs. And any bird, like a guinea fowl, could easily, peck away at the eyeballs of something that's in that cave as well. So there are many possible explanations. I don't think we'll ever really know how exactly the Taung juvenile died.
I think a last call for questions. Are there any? Does anyone have a final question they'd like to pose to Jeff?
Oh, come on. Ask away.
What was it like to work with Tobias?
Well, he's a magnificent person. When you read about somebody and you read their work and then you actually meet them, 9 times out of 10, it's a letdown. Tobias was no letdown at all. He was a magnificent human being. We had our spats. I was there for 10 years, so we didn't always agree, but no, he's the most amazing person I've ever met. Let me put it that way. And I've even met Raymond Dart, so but I didn't work with him.
A question from Susan.
Thank you. This is
Hi, Susan.
This is a question in response to your "oh, come on," because it's really trivial. Picture of the savanna that you used in your slide set. Can you tell me what kind of birds those are? Big, colorful birds.
They are, I'd have to think about it. I have my South African bird book just right over there. But
that's what you get for asking for more questions.
Yeah. Well, I will look that up and I'll send you an email.
Well, while you're looking, we need to know how big their beaks are and whether they peck out eyeballs as well. Excellent.
All right. Well, why don't we wrap it up? Bree, do you have any thoughts from the Anthro Society?
Hi, I just wanted to say big thank you. Really, really enjoyed the talk. So thank you from all of the undergrads and for Anthropology Society. We really enjoyed it. I've been getting messages from people saying how much they're enjoying it.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bree. So thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon. And thank you, Mike, for being here and for giving us the excuse to have the lecture series.
My pleasure.
Great to see everybody.